He's wild.
Would you ever have
kids.
Tate on your podcast?
It's a conversation, right?
You know, they seize his assets. They seize his
Well,
financial
because
banking.
he was saying things about women that he was saying that, like, what did he say that specifically got them triggered?
We're gonna smoke your fuck.
Oh,
dude.
Tate reacts to us?
So Joe Rogan finally did a fight companion with Brian Callen, Brendan Schaub, and Eddie Bravo this past weekend. And it was fun, but there was a lot of interesting things that went down. For example, a lot of people were pointing out the fact that it looked like Joe Rogan was mad or was annoyed at Brian Callen, telling him multiple times to shut up and just, bashing on him. Now, obviously, he trashed Brendan Schaub's whiskey name, Tiger Thick. And a lot of people thought that Eddie Bravo was extremely quiet, was oddly quiet during the entire episode. But what I find more interesting is the fact that Joe Rogan finally publicly defended Andrew Tate. Now, a lot of people are surprised and framing it as, Joe Rogan being a Tate fanboy. But I think there's a deeper reason behind why he did that, honestly. So let's get right into it. Now, before we continue, quick plug, please hit the like button, comment below, subscribe to the channel. And also, we have finally new merch available at comedyenforcement.com. Link below, description, all that stuff. So yeah, appreciate that. So I'm going to include some clips from the Joe Rogan podcast so that you guys are able to follow along. But I'm going to get straight to the point. Because it's clear why Joe Rogan is defending him. He is clearly keeping the doors open to potentially having the most watched podcast episode out there. Okay? I'm talking about ever. I'm talking about record-breaking numbers if Joe Rogan has Andrew Tate on the podcast. So it was no surprise to me hearing him defend Andrew Tate and saying that he was actually open to having him on the podcast. And a lot of people are getting upset at this comment that Joe Rogan said.
Because he's big on TikTok. My 12-year-old and my 14-year-old asked me about Andrew Tate.
And what'd you
my
say?
14-year-old
What'd you
asked
say?
me, I said he's a legit world champion kickboxer. I go, I like him a lot. Why do you like him? And I was asking him. And they said he says a lot of funny stuff on Twitter and TikTok.
When he mentioned that his daughter actually asked him what he thought about Andrew Tate. And Joe Rogan's response was, he's a kickboxing champion and I like the guy. A lot of people seem to be upset at that comment, but in my opinion, that's the correct thing to say. I mean, what is Joe Rogan going to say? What is he going to say to his daughter? No, I don't like the guy because he says bad stuff about women and weak men. And then his daughter could just say, wait, Dad, don't you make a living talking about women and weak men? So clearly that's the right answer for Joe Rogan. So I don't think there was anything wrong with that answer that he gave. Now, to be fair to Brendan Schaub and Brian Callen, they have actually defended Andrew Tate in the past in the past episodes of the Fighter and the Kid podcast. But you could tell that Brendan Schaub and Callen were very excited to talk about him. It was not long before Brendan Schaub was, the one to bring up Tate, and then quickly said that they had seized all of Tate's assets. Luckily, Brian Callen was there to correct the record and tell everybody that's not the case, that did not happen. And then they proceeded to, explain the situation, and then they talked about it with Joe Rogan. But it was clear that they were excited to talk about him because they knew that obviously Tate was going to watch that. 100%, because Andrew Tate and his brother watch anybody that talks about them online. Also, one of their last episodes where they talked about Tate and they had Andrew Tate on the thumbnail of their podcast, that episode did very well. I'm sure they saw that. They saw the analytics and they thought, hey, you know what? Maybe we can get the foot in the door with Andrew Tate and get some of that clout. And here's the reason why I say that. On the last episode of The Fighter and the Kid, towards the last part of the episode, Chin showed Callen and Brendan Schaub a video of Andrew Tate reacting to a clip of Joe Rogan during the fight companion talking about him.
The people on the show let Joe know that it was completely consensual, because that's the thing. I understand if something's taken
by
out
other people, even Brendan.
interpreted.
You could have given a
That's
shout
my
out,
final
Tate.
message.
I've been
Things are taken out
defending.
of context
I'm the one
and
that brought you up and
absolutely
gave the
misinterpreted. That's
point.
why they tried to silence.
And you can tell by Brian's reaction that he was excited. He was happy about it because he quickly asked, oh, he talked about us? Referring to him and Schaub, or maybe himself. And well, in fact, they did talk about them, but they only shouted out Joe Rogan, which I think it's hilarious because by the look of Brendan Schaub's reaction, he was also mad because true, he has been defending Andrew Tate and he was the one to bring him up on the Joe Rogan podcast. But Andrew Tate did not mention them at all. He just said, thanks to Joe Rogan for sticking up for me and clearing up the situation and whatever. And look, in my opinion, there is no right or wrong in this situation. I really think both sides have good points, but this ban is not against freedom of speech. And also think about it. All these social media apps, these platforms, you know, they revolve around the almighty algorithm, right? They spend so much money, so much time crafting that and working on that algorithm. Essentially, anything that goes on those social media apps is going on because they want it to happen. So if Andrew Tate got that big, if he got that huge, that's because the algorithm pushed him. However, he did get way too big, started saying some crazy stuff. And at the end of the day, you have to realize that the people that are working at these platforms, at these social media companies, they're just normal people like you and I, maybe some with different beliefs. You know, different people have different expectations of what is acceptable on their platforms and stuff like that. So again, as a private company or whatever, it's their right to make those choices. So in my opinion, if Andrew got banned from all these social media platforms except Rumble, then go to Rumble and let the free market decide. And, you know, if there is really a market, a demand, a thirst for that, you know, male positive energy or whatever he was providing, then he will thrive and he will get bigger than ever. That's what I think. Now, last, people were saying that Joe Rogan was being mean or he was annoyed at Brian Callen during that podcast.
He wears sandals
Yes,
and he's giving me 2 pairs.
I don't plug anything.
I don't wear
No, they are
sandals.
dope.
I don't plug anything. I don't like that shit.
They're really, you can't even pull them apart, too. Like, if you try to destroy them, like, you know, I saw that video where you guys were just trying to
they're
pull
fucking
them.
amazing.
They're, like, really, really well made.
Yeah.
They're the best flip-flops I've ever had. No,
Callen
really,
about
really
them.
well made. But look, it's got Bigfoot on it.
That's why AG made him.
I mean, it's clear that that's just how friends talk to each other. If Joe Rogan didn't really like Brian, I feel like he would just be fake throughout the podcast and just never talk to him ever again. So I don't think that's a good take to say that he was annoyed at him. After all, Joe Rogan actually did something very, very, very good for Brian Callen. Like I mentioned in my previous video, he gave him essentially he did the best thing that he could do for Brian Callen and made the most organic advertisement for his toehold company, you know, on the podcast. So obviously his toehold company can use that as advertisement, and also all of Joe Rogan's audience will likely be purchasing those expensive sandals. Also, Joe Rogan trashed Brendan Schaub's whiskey name.
And I'm lost
Here,
in the
give me
fight.
a fucking glass so I could pour you some Tiger Thick.
There you go.
Hey.
It's very good whiskey with the worst name ever.
Come on,
Oh,
man.
how dare you.
It's a bad name, but the whiskey's very
The
good.
name.
Obviously, because we all know that Brendan Schaub's business model is essentially to make anything that comes out of his mouth a brand. And finally, a lot of people were pointing out the fact that Eddie Bravo was extremely quiet on that podcast, and were framing it as if Eddie Bravo was miserable and hated being there with both Schaub and Callen. The reality, in my opinion, what I think happened is last week he actually posted, an Instagram story telling everybody that he had just recorded an episode with Joe Rogan alone, which we all know was going to be insane. They haven't done a podcast in a while. Eddie Bravo has been away for a while, so he had his time. So naturally, I think both Joe and Eddie agreed, to allow Brendan Schaub and Brian Callen most of the airtime, because unlike Eddie Bravo, Brian Callen has not had the opportunity to be on Joe Rogan's podcast, by himself and get the spotlight. So that's what I think happened. I don't think there's any bad feelings. I think it was actually a fun podcast, and if anything, Brian Callen was definitely the one to benefit from that the most. But that's all we got for today. See ya.